I'm sure most preachers would probably agree with me on this. The first is you preach for the Monday morning. And what I mean by this is that they preach with an intended goal of having you take some kind of action Monday morning when you go to work. You know, there should be something that we learn here that should influence our Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, whatever it might be, that it influences us how we act or how we live our lives. So preaching for the Monday morning. And then the second goal or purpose for me when I preach is that I'm talking to myself just as much as anyone else. And I'm sure Marty and Mike would agree with me on this, that the things we learn, it's things that we as preachers and ministers can apply to our own lives. You know, it's not something like we have it all down, we've got it all figured out, and we're telling you how you all are messed up. All right. But instead, it's this idea of we are a community and we are helping one another, and we're all growing together. And so with that in mind, let's dive in to tonight's passage. And tonight, we're going to focus mainly out of Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 through 16. That's really, we're going to take a few other passages, but that's really where we're going to basically camp out, and so you can turn there. Ephesians 2, 11 through 16. This is Paul writing to the church in Ephesus. Therefore, remember that formerly you who are Gentiles by birth and called uncircumcised by those who call themselves the circumcision, that done in the body by the hands of men. Remember that at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, and for foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who once were far away have been brought near through the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made the two one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by abolishing in his flesh the law with its commandments and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new man out of the two, thus making peace. And in this one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. And so, some things to know about the church in Ephesus. It's predominantly Gentile Christian or Greek, but then there's also some Christians that come from a Jewish background. And so we've got Gentile Christians, Christians with a Gentile background, meaning non-Jew. And then we've got Jewish Christians that come from a Jewish background. So they were Jews that converted to following Christ. And it's safe to say that because of this mix, there's most likely divisions between the Jews and Gentiles. And I mean, Jews and Gentiles, they were like water and oil. They didn't mix well. And so they had problems with each other. And so you've got this church that's made up of Christians that come from Jewish and Gentile backgrounds, and they're not mixing well. And so this passage is talking to the Gentiles and could most likely be addressing some type of problem or disunity that's going on in the church. And so what I want us to do tonight is just go through these verses, basically verse by verse, and examine them closer and see what we can learn and apply to our own lives, and then kind of talk in general about the whole section. And so as we examine these passages, I think it's important for us to think of ourselves as Gentile Christians at the church in Ephesus. And so let's read verse 11. Therefore, remember that formerly you who are Gentiles by birth and called uncircumcised by those who call themselves the circumcision, that done in the body by the hands of men. And so it's clear that Paul right here is addressing the Gentiles, for they were called the uncircumcised, because circumcision came from the old covenant that God established with his people. And notice he says it's done by human hands. And so that's basically Paul sticking it, which Paul is a Jew, yes, but he's telling the Jews, look, that's done by human hands. All right, and so later Paul's going to talk about a circumcision that's done by God. And so he's addressing the Gentiles in this section. And then verse 12, it says, remember that at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world. And so Paul points out to these Gentiles that they were separated from God. They were without hope. They had no hope, and they didn't know God. And so, you think of like a child being separated from their parents, and they feel lost. They have no idea where they are. They don't know where they're going. And so that's what Paul is trying to emphasize with the Gentiles, that they at one point were separated from God. And this is how we would be if Christ never came. We would have no hope. Just imagine what that means for a second, to have no hope, to be without God. No hope carries with it this idea of lost, but also pointless. If we have no hope in Christ, what's the point of living? No hope brings with it this very dark place and dark situation. I remember when I was a college student, I'd go in to take a test that I hadn't really studied for, spent a little late night talking to friends, playing video games or whatever. I hadn't studied, and I went into that test feeling like there was no hope for me passing this test. And that was just for a test, and I still felt, oh man, you just feel completely worthless, You think, there's no hope for me. This is not going to end well. And that was just for a worldly test. We're talking about no spiritual hope. I mean, it's just, you get this idea of this very dark place. And so Paul started this passage off, kind of with this negative feeling, talking almost kind of like this Debbie Downer kind of. I mean, he said, you all had no hope. You were separate from God. And I just kind of imagine the Gentiles thinking like, oh, well, thanks for that pick-me-up, Paul. This idea of, yeah, thanks for reminding me that, we had no hope. But then he changes. In verse 13, it starts with that word but. That idea of contrast. 13, he says, but now, in Christ Jesus, you who were once far away have been brought near through the blood of Christ. And this idea of being brought near is going to be very critical in the next few verses we look at, which is really kind of the main focus. But it's this idea that the Gentiles were over here. They were kind of excluded from the group. That whole boys club, no girls allowed. All right, yeah, you've seen it on tree houses and stuff. The Gentiles, they're over there, not allowed. But they were brought near through Christ. Those who were once far away were brought near. And then starting in verse 14, Paul starts to address a particular issue for the Christians in Ephesus. So Paul says that Christ is our peace. And what Paul means by that is he's brought peace to the first century Christians. He's brought peace by destroying this dividing wall. And Paul's talking about an actual physical wall here, or referencing it, kind of basically playing off the whole parallel. And so in first century Jerusalem, there was the temple, obviously. We all know about the temple where the Jews would go offer sacrifices. And there's different areas of the temple. And the outer part of the temple would be what's called the court of the Gentiles. And beyond that, there was this large wall. And above the doors for going into the temple or going through that wall, it would say, no foreigner or no Gentile is to go beyond the balustrade and the plaza of the temple zone. Whoever is caught doing so will have himself to blame for his death, which will follow. And obviously, it would have said it in Hebrew and Greek. But it's this idea that Gentiles, you are not allowed to go beyond this point. And it says, whoever is caught doing so, any foreigner who's caught doing so, will have himself to blame for his death, which is followed. And so, like I said, it's like this idea of no girls allowed, the clubhouse that boys make sometimes, the no girls allowed. And so they are on the outside. And so if a Gentile went inside, their punishment was death. And this idea of preventing the Gentiles from entering is what Paul is playing off of. And so Paul's saying that Christ has destroyed this wall metaphorically. And now Jews and Gentiles can come and be before God. They can worship God and have a relationship with God. And so he's kind of laying into the Jews a little bit into this passage. He's saying, look, because of Christ, you are all to be united. So stop creating divisions among yourselves. This idea that you are to be one church, one body. Christ destroyed that dividing wall between the Jews and Gentile Christians. You're all one. And so remember back in verse 12 when Paul said they had no hope and were with God. But now through Christ, in verse 13, Gentiles can have hope. They were brought near. They can know God. And so in verse 14 it says, "For he himself is our peace, who's made the two one and has destroyed the barrier," that dividing wall of hostility, "by abolishing in his flesh the law with its commandments and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new man out of the two, thus making peace. And in this one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility." In verse 15, Paul says, Christ has done away with the law, and now Jews and Gentiles are to be one. They're to be united and have peace with each other and also peace with God. Through Christ, the Gentiles now have hope and now know God because of Christ. And so when we look at this passage, there's two things I want us to get out of it. One is this idea of peace. Christ gives us peace. He gives us hope. From the beginning of time, ever since Adam and Eve sinned, there was a separation between man and God. We all sin. Sin separates us from God, prevents us from knowing God. But Christ enters the picture and removes that sin when we're baptized, when we become a Christian. However you imagine it, but sometimes I've seen it before. It says man and God, and there's this chasm between the two, and that's to represent separation. And then, the next picture, what if we had PowerPoint? We could show that. But this cross comes in, and there was this chasm, and the cross comes in and fills that chasm. I don't know if you all have ever seen that, but that's kind of the picture that comes to my mind, that Christ unites us back with God. He removes that sin so that we can then be in a relationship with God. We can have that peace, that hope. And so there's peace, and that should influence how we live, I think. We have a new perspective on life. We think about things differently as Christians than the rest of the world. So this idea of peace and hope. We talked about what life would be like if you had no hope. Imagine a life where there's no spiritual hope, this idea of pointless and darkness, very dark place. But Christ comes in and gives us light in that darkness, gives us peace and hope. And so we've gotten this idea that, so that's one thing, that God gives us this, He gave it to the Gentiles, to all of us, that God gives us peace, gives us hope, that we can be in a relationship with God. But we also see Paul making a point about the church in general. And I think it's this idea that there's to be no barrier walls, no dividing walls in the church, and this idea of unity. Let's turn over to Galatians chapter 3, verse 28. Kind of similar things going on in the church in Galatia. And Paul says, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, or there's neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." The church in Galatia, like I said, having similar problems between the those Christians with Jewish background and Christians with a Gentile background. And they were arguing over whether or not whether the Gentile Christians needed to be circumcised and all this stuff, and it's causing arguments and problems. And so Paul writes to them and says in Galatians 3:28, "Look, there is no difference between the two. No matter what you all are, you are the same in Christ." He says you are all one. You're to be united. In fact, later on in Galatians, he basically says they're arguing over stupid things. Anyone ever argue with someone, then you look back at it and you think, oh, that was dumb. Why did I even mention that? You think, why were we even arguing over that? That was, Jessica and I, me normally, bring up stupid things. But sometimes we argue and we get upset over the dumbest stuff. We think about that and we look back and we're like, why was that even an issue? And we let that argument become such a problem that we forget that we're actually supposed to be showing love to one another and not causing these divisions or not letting Satan create these divisions between us. And Paul doesn't stop there talking about this idea of unity. In fact, unity was a big thing Paul addressed, and it was a big thing for the church back then, and really not a lot has changed since then, I think. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, starting in verse 12. Probably a familiar verse to most of us. It says, "The body is a unit. Though it is made up of many parts, and though all its parts are many, they form one body, so it is with Christ. For we were all baptized by one Spirit into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, slave or free, and we were all given the one Spirit to drink. Now the body is not made up of one part but many. If the foot should say, 'Because I'm not a hand, I do not belong to the body,' it would not for that reason cease to be part of the body. And if the ear should say, 'Because I'm not an eye, I do not belong to the body,' it would not for that reason cease to be part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? If the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of smell be? But in fact, God has arranged the parts in the body, every one of them, just as He wanted them to be. If they were all one part, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, but one body." I love this image here that Paul provides. The church is a body with many parts, many members. We're all different. No one is the same. You have your hands, you have your mouth, your eyes, your ears, your nose, but together we make up one body. Now, let's think about this for a moment. If we are one body and have different parts, that means some of us are the feet. The feet can be kind of smelly sometimes. They get walked on, literally. Ha ha. Yeah, you'll get that later. But they stink. A lot of people don't like to touch feet. They don't like their feet to touch. They don't like, no one wants someone's feet to touch them. It's gross. They stink, they smell, they get sweaty. Feet can be gross. We're all different parts. Some of us are the feet. And think about this. If you could continue that analogy, some of us might also be the backside. But we're all different parts. And so stick with me for a moment here, but I know it sounds kind of silly, but sometimes some of us can be the less attractive parts. And I don't mean looks, I'm not talking physically, but I just mean personalities. Sometimes we can all be kind of the feet of the church. Not saying we're the feet every day, but just sometimes we say or we do stupid things. We might rub someone the wrong way. We might be a little annoying. We might even be a little gross sometimes. But they're all still part of the body. And that means they're important. And that means we need them. We need everyone. Everyone is important. I remember when I was at OC, and I talk about this a lot to a lot of people, but I had a professor at OC tell me once, he says, "There's no such thing as a perfect church." Meaning you go somewhere, there's always going to be people there that cause problems or you're not going to like them. There's no such thing as a perfect church. And he said, in fact, if you ever do find a perfect church, don't go there because you'll mess it up. And, it's kind of funny, but, it's just a good reminder that, like I said, some of us sometimes are feet. You'll find people in every church that are fighting, people that don't get along. Each church has its own issues. There's no perfect church. Now, Christ makes us perfect, but we are an imperfect people that come together as a body, but are made perfect by Christ. So yes, we're a church body. We're going to come together, and there will be times when we don't get along. I understand that there are times that I'm going to rub people the wrong way. I know that I'm going to say things or do things that not everybody here is going to like. We get frustrated with one another. But there's not one person in this church that I would not go to bat for. There's not one person in this church that no matter how frustrated we might get with one another, there's not one person in here that I don't love, that I wouldn't go to bat for, that I wouldn't defend. And I hope that's the same for all of us. And I feel like it is, that we are to be united. And that's what Paul is talking about here, this idea of unity, that we are one body. 1 John chapter 3. First John 3, verse 11. This is the message you heard from the beginning. We should love one another. Verse 18. Dear children, let us not love with words or tongue, but with actions and in truth. Chapter 4, verse 7 and 8. Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. We are to love one another. Now, like I said at the beginning, many times when I preach, one of the goals, I'm preaching to myself just as much to anyone else. And this is a reminder I have to tell myself that even though there might be stinky feet out there, we're to still love one another, be united as a body. In Ephesians 2, Paul said that Christ has destroyed the barrier or the dividing wall, has made the two groups, Jews and Gentiles, into one. And many times in our own churches, we can create dividing walls or barriers where we can't connect with someone or talk to them. And so, what are our dividing walls? Has someone annoyed us or hurt us in some way? Does someone think differently than us? Whatever the walls might be, we have to remember the words of Paul. The two were made into one. The body is one. Unity in the church is what's most important. In fact, let me say it like this. Unity is what's most important, even if it means not getting what we want. And so tonight, I want to offer an invitation. And we'll still, here in a moment, we'll stand and sing a song. And if anyone would like to be baptized tonight or need the prayers, we'll certainly still offer that invitation. But I want to encourage you, during the song, think about our own walk as individuals, as a church body. What dividing walls have we set up with one another? In this church, what dividing walls? Am I loving one another? Are we united? And what can I do to improve on it? Even if the answer is yes, what can I do to make it better? How can I encourage someone else? And so I just want to encourage us as a body to be united with one another. That we look past any differences, that we stand united as a church, that we may not agree on everything, but we love one another despite our differences. Let's stand and sing.